I live in Moline, and I had a 32-year career with International Harvester, and Joyce worked 25 years for United Airlines.
America.
And we've both been retired over 14 years, enjoying some of the good life. What we can do right now, in just a minute, is take a walk around downtown Galva. Not the way it is now. The way it was when we were growing up. This all got started back a little over 4 years ago in the fall of 2008. I had some free time and I was thinking about our reunion, just like you had tonight, and I volunteered. I went to the committee and volunteered to help out on the committee. I volunteered to MC the evening, and I volunteered to come up with a program. And they immediately accepted, and I didn't have a clue what that program was going to be. That fall, I wrote a poem. Now, over the years, I've written a lot of poems for surprise parties and roasts and some of my golfing buddies and stuff like that. This poem was entitled Ode to Galva and the Class of '59. And it really was about the first 18 years of our life in Galva, 1941 to 1959. A little bit of history, some of the school teachers that we had. I mentioned some of the elementary, junior high teachers, high school teachers. And I almost got all of the names in of all the classmates, cheerleaders, football team, got them all sprinkled in there. Turned out okay. It was a little wordy, but it rhymed, and that was one thing that I did. Then there was a big gap. Over Christmas, into the spring, I didn't have a clue about what else I was going to do. I needed something to stimulate me a little bit, and I thought of the Galva magazine. You might remember that. George Swank started that in 1958, and it published several issues a year until he passed away in 1996. And there were 327 issues. Now, during all those years, my folks subscribed and kept many, or lots of issues. And Joyce and I subscribed and got some over the 70s and 80s. My mom died about the same time as George Swank, so we merged the piles, the stacks, and we ended up with 321. We were only 6 short. We got them from the Historical Society, and I put them all together in order and stuck them in the back of the closet in 1996. Took them out in 2009, just before the reunion. I went through every one of them, starting with number 1. I took a bunch of notes, and after I got through all of them, it took several days through several hours each day. I looked at the notes and found that it would be fun, and I put together one page of train trivia, a couple of pages of miscellaneous trivia that I thought was interesting, and a couple of pages of dates chronologically in order. And Joyce made a bunch of copies, and I started a packet that I was going to hand out to every classmate. So we published that, we made copies of the poem, and a few other odds and ends, and we had a CD that was called Test Your Memory, just some old songs. Jimmy Buffett, the Statler Brothers, Anne Murray, but there were songs that would make you think and remember the time, the 40s and the 50s. So we duped a bunch of copies, and that went in the packet. So everybody got one of those, and we mailed some out to the class members that didn't show up. But I was still missing one thing. And all said and done, downtown Galva. We were nearby and watched it fade away over the years. So I thought it might be fun to do something about a walk around downtown Galva. And that's what we did. A stroll around downtown Galva, the sights, the sounds, and smells, the way I remember it in the late 40s and 50s, and early 60s. And that's why I'm here And I did it for my class. Then I was asked to do it for the class of 60. Then in the next year, the class of 56. You might remember Harlow Westland and Garth Youngberg. They'll both be out here tonight. Good friends. And then the next year, the class of last year, the class of 62. And the invitation, it's good to be fun to see you guys and afterwards. And remember, I know some of you guys. I remember some of you. Anyway, we're going to start that. We're going to do it fairly quickly so I don't take up too much of your night. We're going to start this stroll on the south side at the city service gas station. Early on, there was a diner there. You may not remember that, but there was. I vaguely remember that.
Bernie's.
It went away. They built the service station in the late 40s, white, green, lunch counter on the side. It's all gone now, of course. Across the street, there was a small service station, still operating today. It might be Phil's, or I don't really know that. Back across the street was Richard Fenn's Sinclair Station. Back across the street was the International Harvester Store. Gail Overball, Grampy Clayton, Bob Overball took over later on. That's all gone now. Across the street was Vernon Shell. Back to the right was a little station called Zephyr, the Spot Restaurant. And back across the street, just next to the tracks, Abe Lindbergh had his bulk shell service headquarters. So we've gone a block and a half, and we've named 5 gas stations. I tried to figure out how many there were during this period of time. Of course, it changed off and on, but I think there was around 14 or 15. There were also 8 grocery stores. Blacks on the north side going out of town, East End Market out on 954, and 6 downtown at that time. And we'll mention all 6 as we walk by them. Okay, it's time to go across the tracks to the north side real quick. Whoops, the arm comes down. Do you remember all the times when you're walking, riding a bike, or in a car, the hundreds of times you had to wait for a train? Well, we're going to look down to the east, and here comes the train. You see the smoke, that unique whale whistle. It's obviously a steam locomotive. The railroad and those engines, the whole rail system was very important to Galva's history. Even back in those days, there was 1 or 2 steam locomotives assigned to Galva just to switch cars around town to the various businesses. The old depot, long gone now, but you remember the east end was for freight, and the west end was the waiting room with those hard benches, and the ticket office. Remember the dolly? Anybody remember that? It used to pull up right to the west of the station, and its run would be through Nakoma, Woodhall, Alpha on its way to Boston. Its last run was in 1951. Also, the Rock Island Line sliced through Galva, north to south, if you remember. Early on, all through the 40s, we lived in a house right next to the Grace Methodist Church. So right across the Route 34, the Rock Island Line ran right there. So growing up, I got to watch those trains go by all the time. Always freight trains and coal trains. Riding around on a bike on the south side, I noticed if you might remember the old depot, the Rock Island Line depot that sat right there. It was never open. So I just sort of assumed there was nothing, never any passenger. I wondered what that depot was there for. Well, I found out by reading the Galva land that there were 2 depots. The first one was built back around 1860. It was torn down about 25 years later. And the one that we remember was built in the late 1890s and torn down in 1970s. But reading the Galva land, I found out back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, before roads, hard roads, train was the main, train travel was the main way to get down. There was roughly 12 trains that went through Galva on the Rock Island Line. 6 were passenger trains. 3 going each way. Never did figure out why they didn't run into each other. Galva was really a hub. Burlington line going north and south, or east and west, and Rock line going north and south. A lot of people got off in Galva, walked to the other depot so they could go the other way. There was also the interurban. I heard the name, didn't know too much about it. You might remember the tracks going through, up past the hotel, down past the candy shop and around town. It was a streetcar, electrified streetcar, that went to Kewanee. It first started its run in 1906, and its last run was in 1932. It was a streetcar that held 46 people. It had a baggage compartment, a toilet, and of course lights. In the key part of probably around the teens, it ran 18 hours a day. Half an hour up to Kewanee, half an hour back. 18 round trips at that point in time. One interesting little article I found in all the Galvans was a guy wanted to get the Camrys to file some papers at the courthouse around 1908. To get there, he took the interurban to Kewanee. Then he walked over and got on the big stagecoach to go to Geneseo, where he switched to get in the little stagecoach to go to Kewanee. I mean, Cambridge. There weren't any cars, and there was stuff to get around. Like I said, the interurban stopped in 1932. Okay. Arms up, across the tracks, waterworks, police station, and there used to be a third building right there as a maintenance building, torn down a long, long time ago. Whistle goes off. Obviously, our walk is at 7 in the morning, noon, 1, or at 5 a.m. The wind's from the west, and if you remember, Houghton Lumber Company first opened, by the way, in 1882. I always remember there were some red hog houses right across from the waterworks, some piles of wooden fence posts, and some wire fencing all bound up. We've made the turn. Now we're coming to the home office of the Houghton Lumber Company. Now you can really smell all the lumber. And there's Mr. Houghton getting in his big, shiny car, pulling away. And as always, sitting in the passenger front seat were 2 little sacks, white sacks of pink and white candy. They would drop off as he drove around town. Okay, we're going west. Next stop is Miller's, Dwayne and Norman Pier. That's one store that I went into mostly early on when I was pretty little. I tagged along with my parents. I remember it being a pretty neat store, wallpaper paint, greeting cards, gifts. And as a kid, I always wondered why a nice store like that was way out, away from the real downtown. Couldn't figure that one out. We're going west, we come to the police station and City Hall. Maybe you tagged along with your parents when you were little, when they had to pay the water bill or had a problem with the property taxes. Inside, right around the corner, was the city clerk office. Homer Pryor was the city clerk almost all the time when we were growing up. And if you got that far, like I did occasionally, you always had to go a little bit further back, peek around the corner to the right, and look at the fire trucks. And when you're little, they seem to be really big. We're going west, reliable cleaners, and next is the creamery. First thing you notice about that is the smell. Yeah. It was not bad, but it wasn't really good. Maybe the trucks, always a lot of trucks around. Maybe a semi backed in, a lot of yellow trucks all over the place. And under the awning in the back, there were always a lot of milk cans. Now, the first creamery was established on the south side of town, 1905. And on the property that we're looking at, early on, for 56 years, there was a 2-story wooden hotel called the Baker House. Like I say, it was there for about 56 years, torn down in the teens, and the creamery that we knew was built and opened around 1924-25. Obviously a major player in Galva history. Now, Everything's torn down. There's sadly but a grassy lot, as we know. We're going west past Two Jacks Tavern. Next, a different kind of smell, Jacobson's Bakery. Now, as close as we lived, I didn't realize until a few years ago that they're still open. Same place. It's a little different if you're from out of town and haven't been in there lately. You walk in, you won't ever see a clerk. The fresh goods are on a shelf, wrapped up and marked, and there's a great big sign that says pay, and there's a big metal safe type container chained to the floor so no one can walk out with it. And it says, please pay, put your money in the slot, and if you don't have the right amount, make it right the next time you pop in. It's just an amazing thing. You got to go and see it sometime. And we have friends that still order rusks and have them shipped UPS. We're going west, and you come to a pair of stairs going down. They're not there right now, but I went to a barber shop. You look closer, you might see Gilbert Reed and Slats Hudson going down the stairs. Next stop is the first of the 6 grocery stores, Garrigan's. Matt Garrigan, owner. Now, if you think back, your parents probably didn't shop at all 6 stores. Maybe they shopped by location, north side, south side. Maybe they liked the meat counter at one place, or maybe they just shopped at a store because they were friends with the owner. In my case, my mom's dad was named Elmer Craig, and he was a neighbor and a really good friend of Matt Garrigan. So I tagged along a few times when I was really little. My memory is pretty vague. I remember white, black, short aisles, a meat counter way in the back left, and they had some freezers, lockers. You get your meat chopped up the way you wanted it, and you had your own private little locker there. We're going west, and the next stop that I remember is the interlocking store. Now, when I was in 5th grade, we moved to a house north of Wiley Park, and I met some new friends. Quite a few, but 2 stand out, especially in the 5th and 6th, 7th grade. We're doing a lot of running around as kids. Dick Dexter and Phil Lovell. We did a lot of stuff together. I'm going to mention these guys a couple of times because when we went into the interlocking store, we went in because we'd never been in there before. Didn't really know what was in there. If you were a farmer, you'd know more than I did. But there was a big metal tank. I think it was water windmills would fill them up with water for stock, and there was some more fencing, and there was some stuff that we couldn't even figure out. We didn't stay long. On the way out, we said hi to Don Falk, who was the manager. Now we're at the aisle, the alleyway. Halfway down through the double doors, upstairs to the Opry House. Now, the Opry House was a major player in Galva history. Built in the 1880s, maybe. The high school that we all went to opened in 1932. Prior to that, graduations, school plays, all sorts of civic activities were held at the Opry House. Even, I think when I was a junior, senior, they had teen clubs there. I don't know if they still had that when you went to school or not. I went a few times. I remember walking around that place, how old I thought it was, and I bet it was really spooky. But it was a major player back then. Right downstairs in the corner, Dr. Maginot had an office for a while, and from 1948 to 1952, the only lady doctor that I'm aware of that worked in Galva had her office there. Her name was Ann Hopple. Next is Amy's. Now, most of the stores along there had back doors. You went in the back door, you come in the tables for 2, tables for 4, and in the middle there were the big round tables for family, dining, great lunches, great Sunday brunches or meals. A favorite spot for a lot of people. Next door was grocery store number 2. Back in the late 40s and early 50s, it was the Royal Blue store, owned by Homer Pryor. In the mid-50s, Pete Westland moved over there in the red white store. Next door was Gamble's. Maggie Smith owner. My only recollection of Gamble's is that it was cluttered. You never really shopped in there. You went in for something, you could never find it. You always had to ask for help. And you still had trouble finding it. It was just an unorganized store. Next is Fansters. Elmer and Axel Fanster. Men's clothing and boys' clothing. Early on, really early on, I really knew that that place wasn't really up to snuff as far as latest fashions. They were just a few years behind. Now, a couple of tidbits. If you remember the counter, there was a big metal contraption with that held a big roll of blue heavy paper. And I always remember, if you ever went in there and bought anything, it would be wrapped up in this heavy blue paper. Sometimes it was wrapped tight over the string or a piece of tape, and you left with a bundle, a blue bundle. They didn't like bags or sacks in those days, I guess. One other fill-in-Dixie story. We knew all the back doors along that north row were pretty active, except we never saw anybody go in and out of fan screws. So one day we thought it'd be locked, but it wasn't. We go in the back door, and there is Elmer Fanstrom sitting at a table about the size of two cardboard tables with a sewing machine on. He was running a sewing machine. I remember that because I never seen a man run a sewing machine. And we sort of scared him, and he scared us, and we just went on through and went right out the front door. But in reading the Galva, there was an article about them. There's a picture of the young Fanstrom brothers, taken probably in 1920. There were hat boxes all over the store, the same stupid roll of paper on the counter, but there weren't any racks of suits. And reading the article further, it sort of all came together. Back in the day, you pick out your material, get measured, and during the 20s and early 30s, there were as many as 6 full-time tailors working in that factory. So that all sort of came together. Next stop, about 2 steps down, there was a door. And if you ever went up that door to get the picture taken at Fitz Carlson's studio, I went through there twice, dusty, dim, scary, spooky stairs. You go around the studio and there was no color. There wasn't anything but black, tan, and brown. I mean, it just... But when we lived on the south side, I remember he lived somewhere on the south side. You might remember him driving around, and he had a Model T type car with the top down. And he always had to sit on about 2 pillows. He was a little guy, and his wife was about big. And I'll never forget that image. Next stop is Sunburst shoe stores. There were 3 shoe stores in Galva back at that time. Fry's on the south side. I don't think everybody's shoes in there, but I went in for a repair a couple times. Hintz Brothers on the west side. Now, Dick, Phil, and I went in there one day because we'd never been in there, and we found the shoes, but mostly they were boots, overall shoes, and work shoes, and that kind of stuff. There was also a lot of clothing. Mostly what we saw were overalls and flannel shirts. We found one bin way in the back, leather stuff. We finally figured out it was probably bridles and harnesses for horses. And we were going to go back around and see the rest of the store, and we bumped into Mr. Hintz, who was a big guy, white hair, and he sort of scared us, so we just left, and I never did see the rest of the store. And that was the only time I was in there. I sort of missed that because the other guys had told me it was sort of a neat store, but I didn't see it all. Oh, yeah. Now we're back to Sunburst. By far the best selection of shoes. Gordon and his parents ran the place, of course. And I remember buying shoes in there. However, I have to admit, my dad took me up to Bowman's in Tijuana for shoes mostly during high school. I didn't buy them or anything.
That where you stuck your feet in there and you had clean.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, they used to have the deal where you could X-ray and see how the shoes.
Next stop is Sloan's. Go in the back door of Sloan's. If you ever went in the back door of Sloan's, you remember the smell. Medicine and pills. And back in the 50s, it was a pretty innocent time because they weren't behind locked doors. All those bottles were just sitting out. It wouldn't work today because someone in here pilfering a bunch of those and making some sort of a medical cocktail to get high on. If you went in the front door of Sloan's, the first thing I always, as a kid, remember was the comic book rack. Halfway down on the right, there was a soda fountain in there for a long period of time. It eventually went away. Now, Keith Sloan was the owner. My folks are really good friends with Keith and Sliss, and one thing because I went in that store a lot, as most of us probably did, early time. But he was always nice. He always, if he wasn't real busy, he always stopped to ask how things were going. He was one of the good guys. Hobbs on the corner, might have been there once. Jewelry store. I always knew it was just dark in there. I always thought jewelry stores were light, bright, and sort of air. It was just dark. I didn't understand. Maybe they were selling cheap stuff. I don't. Make the turn. We're going down north now. Joe Lord had an insurance office there for a while. And as we come to a little stop right in the far corner, it's time to go in for a pop or a hot dog at McClure's. Now we're going to stop right in that corner from there. We're not going to walk. We're just going to look across the street. And there goes Dorothy Talbot, right through the double doors, straight back into Eckbert's, where she worked for a long, long time. To the same double door, to the left, Fred Waller had his insurance company. Now, Fred was I got to know him a little bit. His only child was a daughter, Johanna. Do any of you remember Johanna Waller? She was by far the smartest kid that I ever met in my life. She was our valedictorian, and she got to know me. In fact, our folks and her folks were members right here, and we learned to play golf. And I played a lot of golf with her senior year. A little sidetrack. In '59, the only golf team Galva had was established by me, Freddie Lohr, and Jimmy Kurtz, who played golf out here. You remember Jimmy, don't you? And two other guys from my class, Johnny Croming and Whitney Long. And we played 4 matches. Dave Billings was our coach. And I told Johnny yesterday, we played out here in the tournament in Galva, that I really wish I would have invited Johanna. Then we really would have made history, having the first golf team and a lady on the team. And I think she could beat Johnny back then. But Fred passed away real early, when we were still in high school. And that's when Chuck Hay took over and ran the business for many, many years. Right up the stairs, same building, is Doc Berkey's office, dentist. Many of you probably were up there as a kid. Called everybody kid. Always wanted to talk. And then right about the time he'd ask you a question, he also put his fingers in your mouth and you couldn't answer. I got to know him pretty well over the years, and he was a great guy. Downstairs, just to the west, was the plumbing shop. Harry Kempen worked there and then bought the business in the early 50s from a fellow named Paul Wheaton. A little further west, John Bogren had a real estate business there and a small antique shop. Right next was the Crown Cafe. Now the Alderman family, I think, owned that the whole time. They started in 1920. And it was a major player. I didn't realize that because I was only in there a couple of times in the late 40s for family Sunday brunch. But it was a lot of articles in the Galva Land about the Crown Cafe, and it was just a busy place, a major player. I remember one thing about the Crown Cafe, however, when I was a little kid. The food was always pretty good, but no matter what I ordered, you get a little glass of tomato juice and one Ritz cracker as an appetizer. Oh, it was all right. But, believe it or not, I realized way back then that there had to be a better way to start a meal than that. You get a little bit bigger glass, you fill it with ice, and fill it full of either Grey Goose or Kettle One, then you twist. Now that's the way you start. Next stop is right west, a little standard station. We went away a long, long time ago, but there was a bigger standard station on the south side, Sweat's. Back in the day, I can remember when Theodore Sweat, Ray Sweat, Bob Sweat, and Hook Ringgold. Later on, Bob Sweat and Hook were the primary. That was a major gas station in town. Right across the street from these little gas stations was a house where Doc Smith had his office for a long time. Now that's all gone. Just to the south was the Mobile station. You might remember that big red horses. coming back to where we're standing, there was a little office where Jim Young had his lawyer's office. And he was mayor, as we know, for many, many years. Good guy, and he graduated in 1932 from Galva. Right across the street where we're standing was the original firehouse. Still standing there, small doors. Must have little fire trucks back then. I think it's been abandoned, used for storage for all these years. But back in the late 40s, for a brief period of time, two well-known mechanics separately had their garage in there. Lyle Peterson was in there first for a year or two, and later Harry Reason was in there. Now we're going southward to Trace. Now we're walking. We come to the phone company. Dick's dad, Peyton Dexter, was the owner-manager. That was in the Dexter family almost the entire time. The first phone company opened for business in 1898 and had 109 subscribers. If you went in that store for any particular reason ever, or the office, you'd never forget the smell. All the phone equipment, it just had a unique smell. And maybe you went up, I did a few times, you went and watched the operators upstairs do their thing. It was pretty boring to see everyone. But they all lost their job in summer of 1957 when the dial system went into town.
There we go.
Next door was the post office. Ed Haynes was postmaster for many years, and upstairs Rip Everett had his law office. I went up there a few times. I don't know why, but if you were up there, you'll remember that. Huge conference table, hundreds of law books, and then his office looked right down over the street. He was my neighbor on the north side. Got to know him and Rippy, and he was a major player and a major politician. Downstairs is grocery store number 3, Kroger's back in the 40s, and that's where I went in all the time. Pete Westland ran that first. Ran up and down the aisles, and we went there mainly because my dad and Pete Westland were in the same class of 30, as were two other guys we just mentioned, Don Falk and Peyton Dexter were all in the class. They were all classmates. Next was Emily Neam's ladies' store. In there a few times when I was really little, tagging along with her. Emily lived to be over 100. She ran that store for years and years. Great lady. Liked to have fun. I made her more than one bourbon and water in my life. Great lady, great store. Next is grocery store number 4. Good Bars, X-Deads, whatever. The only time I was ever in that, Phil Lobo was AWOL, Dick and I went in there one day. We walked around, it seemed like a nice store. I was just never in there. Had a little funny smell. And I think we missed an apple on the way out, and that was my only experience in that store. The last store on the north side was the dime store. Pretty good sized store. I liked to go in there early on because there was a toy department halfway down, back to the left. And that was sort of trying to poke some money out of my folks or whatever, and but it took about a year. I still was only about 7. I realized that was really a cheap, crummy toy department. It was a waste of time. It was nothing but junk. And really, the rest of that store, if you're a little guy, was a real waste of time. There was nothing in that store for us, at least for me. And I know for a fact I was never in there in the 50s. I never went back in. Okay, we're at the tracks, but the arm comes down. We can't go to the south side. This time we look to the west, and there's a train coming that's really moving. It is not, there's no smoke. It's the Denver Zephyr. Stainless steel, passenger train, going very, very fast, and it's diesel. Now, one thing I found out in reading this, all these articles, in 1949, there were approximately 29,000 steam locomotives operating in the United States. In 1959, there was slightly less than that. So we lived during the transition where diesel came up, steam went down. Now, the Denver Zephyr, if you remember, used to stop in Galva early on. Then we became small, and we had to go to Galesburg and join to get on the train. But it was fun to watch, and it was special. Slight deviation here. We didn't go into Chicago very much because Joyce, we had benefits on United, so a lot of our married life, we flew in and out of Chicago. But since 9/11, we retired. flying is basically a pain whether you have a ticket or not. So we've done a lot of car traveling, and we've gone to Chicago and over a couple of trips up there. We visited a lot of museums. When you were little, how many went to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago? Anybody been in the last 10 years or so? Well, we did one day. I'm going to give you just a quick synopsis. If you remember, you go down Lakeshore Drive, turn back to the west, and all of a sudden this huge limestone building. You park in front of all those stairs in and buy your ticket. Look up all the little beach planes hanging from the ceiling and all that sort of stuff. Well, we got there a few years ago, and there's nothing in front but a grassy lot. You have to go around to the side, and the west side come in, and there's a huge underground parking lot, which I think is under what used to be the parking lot. And you walk into an underground room, and that's where you buy your tickets. And they're up to date now. If you want to see the coal mine or the submarine or that stuff, you buy a ticket. They're free anymore. You have to buy a ticket. But it's time stamped. So for the time you walk around, so you get to the coal mine, you're there, the ticket's good from 11 to 11:30. They won't let you go through unless you have that. Anyway, the first thing we saw before we bought our tickets was the nose of the Denver Zephyr. I completely didn't know that when it retired until the early 60s from running, it went to the Museum of Science. It was a real surprise to see the nose. You walk up a little bit further, they used to sit outside, they rehabbed it, refurbished it. The whole train is in a long rectangular room. They dug it right next to the underground parking lot. It was fun to see. The submarine, which used to sit outside in World War II, is now in a room in the back. A room, huge, bigger, huge room. It's been refurbished. And we went upstairs to look at the train and some of the planes. And I didn't know this was buttered up against the museum, the mezzanine. Is a 727 airplane with one wing out over the whole thing. And it was really interesting to watch the little film they have downstairs and how they got that thing in. I'm not going to tell you how they did it. I know how they did it, but I'm not going to tell you. But for a 4-hour trip, sometime if you're in Chicago, 3-4 hours you can see it. It's really fun. But that was the last time I saw the Denver Zephyr. Okay, no more train. Arms up, across to the south, we see Swanks. Now Hathaway's. Hathaway's ever closes, and it could be anything. But back in the day, Swanks moved in that store in front about the middle of the 20s. As we know, Galva was incorporated in 1854. In 1855, the first brick building ever built in Galva was built on that side. That is the original first brick building, 1855, by our friends from Bishop Hill. They're 8 years older than we are, but they didn't have the railroad. They were industrious. They had stuff to sell. They made stuff, and they had grain to sell. So they built that building to be a warehouse, a colony warehouse. They brought all their stuff to Galva by horse and wagon, and then went out around the Midwest by train. Now, we know Swanks opened up in the 20s. The colony warehouse was there for quite a few years. I really don't know how many. But in the middle, there was a bank in that building, a restaurant, and the first home of the Galva News. We're going south past Lammon's. Now, there is a light and airy jewelry store, the way it should be. And now we come to the home of the Galva News that we all remember where it was all the time we were going up. And upstairs was a 4-lane bowling alley, manual pin set. Anybody ever go up there and set pins? I did. It didn't take long. I realized that was just a bad deal. That was wasn't worth it. Now the next little area is sort of neat, I think. The 3 J's. Jim's, Joe's, and the Jug. Also in that area for a while was Snyder's Drugstore. But we're going to talk about those 3 J's. You remember as a kid, a little kid walking by, the smell of the booze, the stale beer, the cigarettes, the laughter from inside. And the amazing thing, almost every time as a little kid you see somebody come out there, they were smiling. I knew immediately that those places were going to require further investigation. Now my dad was a good friend of Jimmy High's. Now, if anybody knew Jimmy High's, this guy was an all-time character and a really good guy. And I met him a few times, but I didn't ever get to go in there until I was 21. And then I went in there. So first time I ever went in there, and this is a true story. It's a piece of useless trivia, but I'm going to mention it. I went in there, my birthday's in December, so I was home from college. And it was Christmas time. I went in there. And Heiss gave me all kinds. He wanted to see my ID. It was just almost embarrassing. But my dad was in there. I'll never forget this. Sitting next to Fred Lord, Rampy Clayton, Tom Campbell, and Bill Simmons. And never forget that. And a lot of fun in that place. Lots of fun. Good guy. I was never in Joe's. For some reason. Now we get to the jug. You know, that was a little more of Heiss's was, you hardly ever saw a woman. There were people with once in a while. It was pretty much a guy. Card games, poker games, tip boards, you know, those were all illegal. A lot of fun. Now the jug was more of, you know, modern, dates, wives, all that sort of stuff. Remember the jug sign? It went up and the jug opened in 1948. The hotel, major player back then. The Eisenhower administration in 1956, Congress passed the interstate law, but the interstates weren't done all 10 years ago. So Route 34 and Route 17 came into play, and the hotel was very, doing a lot of business. The lunch counter in the back, the main dining room. They had 3 ways you could pay, daily, weekly, and they had a monthly rate. Several people lived there year-round. Remember those great big heavy wooden green chairs they put out in front in the summertime? Very uncomfortable, heavy. You might look closely and see a couple guys that lived there. Dougie Sale and Maury Loveman used to live there. Now, sadly, from the jug all the way down, including the furniture store and Good Dale's barbershop, all torn down, all gone. Pretty sad. Across the street is the best building. Now, back in the day, it was a major player, big interior courtyard, open air courtyard, all the apartments around upstairs. Right across the street, Hammerstrand had their business. Erickson Brothers, grocery store number 5. Ted and Alley. Pretty busy store. One thing I remember about that store, I always thought that was their first store. It wasn't. Their very first store was where the Royal Blue and Peach Red and White store was, way back in the early 20s, 30s. And Gary's store, that wasn't their first store. Their first grocery store was in the plumbing shop. We're going west, past Lundin, or going east, past Lundin's. Pictures. Past Lundin's Insurance, and Alta Mern had her dress shop. I might have been in there once, don't remember much about that, but that store originally housed the first movie theater Galva ever had. 1911, the Princess Theater opened and showed movies there until 1927. That's when the show opened that we all went to. All the time. Now, the sad thing about this whole thing is I'm hearing they're going to tear down the Capitol. It's already falling down. But they're going to tear everything down, including where the show was. Something like that whole half a block is going down there. Now the show, we remember that. Westerns on Friday nights and the matinees on Saturday. If you walk out the show in the summertime, the first thing you'd see would be South Central Park. North Central Park, South Central. Piece of trivia. The first 50 years or so, Galva, there's nothing but a dirt field. Maybe a tree or two. Corn cribs, outbuildings. That's all there were on both sides. Around the turn of the century, the city decided to squish it up a little bit and start building or creating parks. They planted some trees, tore down all the buildings. Back in those days, and there's some neat pictures of Galva that I don't think I've ever seen before. All the streets were dirt. All the sidewalks around town were wooden. There were hitching posts. I mean, but it all developed. And the dirt streets downtown remained until 1913. They started to put in the brick streets. You remember the They were blacktopped over in 1958. Sometime in the 40s, I think, maybe 30s, each park had a bandstand. The South Park in 1960 became a parking lot. The next thing to be paved in Galva was around 1920, and they paved around Wiley Park and some of the other main arteries. And I just assumed that the Route 34 and 17 were paved, but they didn't even start to pave them until 1923. I didn't realize that, so it was dirt roads until that time. Okay, maybe coming out of the show one summer afternoon, you look across and you see two Galva chargers sitting on one of the metal benches. They'd probably been in Joe's for 2 or 3 hours, so they were sort of mellow. One was pretty famous at the time for playing the spoons, and his name was Ray Wall. The other one was pretty much a real character, and I got to know him a little bit when I was little. My grandpa Johnson was in the corn shelling business. He had a shop. We mentioned that very briefly at the end. This guy worked for him for a while. He had the all-time great beard with the Centennial in 1954. He also spent many winters in Vandalia at a prison farm because he knew just how to do enough to be sentenced for 3 months and had a heated pad. You might remember him. His name was Albert Hallgren. You might remember him more. His nickname was Galva. Okay, back across the street. We're going to wrap this thing up at the candy shop. You all remember Vernon Swanson. Seersucker pants, white shirt, rolled up the sleeve. Now he worked there for a year or two when Herman Bogner owned it. Vern bought it in 1951. And he worked too hard on it. This is trivia. I get a kick out of telling this part because yeah, it's true. He was a man of routine. Now he worked really hard to make it a go, and his routine was to work there in the morning. And if you went in the morning, he was almost always there. Around lunchtime, give or take, or right after lunch, it was time for his lunch. And he went out the back door. Now, on the south side, there were back doors, just like this. He would get in his car and drive west around behind the hotel, park the car, and go into his favorite place for Jimmy Heise's. The back door. There were back doors on the west side. Now, being a man of routine, now Heise, if you ever, I know a couple of you guys are in Heise, it wasn't, well, he cooked in there, but boy, he belonged in jail. It wasn't very fun. But he liked to cook. He'd have soup or maybe a sandwich now and then. He had a grill. Tough. Anyway, Vern ordered almost the same thing for lunch. A green bottle of Highland Special Export beer. And after several of those, he went home, routine, took a nap, cleaned up, and went back, and he was almost always in there in the evening. One other tidbit about him, when he bought the building from Irving Wagner, he had to borrow some money. Now, we skipped 2 loan or bank loan institutions at the time. One was next to the plumbing shop, Galva Savings and Loan, run by the Leaf League. The other was the First National Bank, right next to the between the telephone company and the roads. And this is completely useless. Where did he get his loan? Neither. He got it from Rip Everett. And I know for a fact he paid it back way early because the guys like us that went to the candy shop a lot, he was a real successful. Next stop, the Galva Cafe. Pizza. Vern Peterson, owner. If you ever had a Star Courier paper route, you're familiar with that store because you always got your papers in the back of the store. I remember mainly, well, 2 tidbits. Bonnie's dad. Bonnie was in my class. And I also remember because on the little lunch counter, there were little wooden hard stools. And I went up there as a little kid, 4 or 5 years old, and had lunch with my Grandpa Johnson a few times. And you could look into the kitchen area. And hamburger, and you always put the buns right. They never got toasted, but they were warm and greasy. I never had hamburger like that. A hamburger with your grandpa for a quarter, and a frosted mug of red beer is a priceless memory, and I remember the Galva Cafe because of that. Next stop is Al's Dairy. Always well done in there. neat store. But a lot of kids were either candy shop kids or Al's Dairy kids. The one thing I went to Al's Dairy for was a chocolate shake. The best, thickest, you had to eat with a spoon. Get it for a quarter. Now, if you're familiar with the Quad Cities, or live there, we're good friends with two brothers that own an ice cream company called Fighters. There's lots of stores around the Quad Cities. If you like ice cream, you got to go in there. I still love a chocolate shake. They cost just a little bit more than Al's Dairy. Quarter versus $4.50. Next, Nebraska, barbershop right next door to Al's Dairy. And then the sixth grocery store was Freeburg's. You may not remember that. It was there for 20, 30 years. I remember going in the back door when I was living on the south side. For a couple pennies, you could get some hard candy. It was a really old store. It smelled old, dark, sort of the wooden floors like the general store over at Bishopville, but darker. Bad store. Anyway, it closed in the early 50s, and eventually that became the pool hall for a lot of years. The funeral home, Oscar Johnson started it. You might remember Sweet Johnson, Barb's dad from the class. He passed away like Fred Waller, way early in life. In the late 50s, that's when Haskell Gill and Don Schuster came to town and bought into that business. Yeah. Right next, just west of the Winnish Mill, was the Chevy store. Stewie Murchison owned it. Fred Lord came to town around 1950, moved into our other neighbor on the west side. He bought that from Stewie Murchison. He also bought some property just west of Spuddy Naislin's little barbershop, if you might remember. There was an open area, and then the Case store was there. He tore that down and built his garage. Freddie was in my class, and Fred Sr. I thought it was supposed to be picked up. Fred was one of the two. He liked that one. I don't know. I lost a lot of money. Pretty good card. Winnischville I just mentioned, remember going by there on a bike or walking or whatever, remember how dusty it used to be when that place was operating? Right across the street, Fortune Track, was a big white building, poultry house. I was never in there, but we all know what they did to chickens in that place. There was an alley, and right across the east of that little alley, there was a little independent gas station, which is gone now, but there was the ice house. And the ice house is still standing. It's tilted a little, but it's still there. And there was an office for the coal yard. Remember the coal, always in the train, the big pile of coal before natural gas took over? So, was that right? Okay. And then right across the street to the south was the blacksmith. Stewie Fancy, a lot of Stewies. Now, if you ever walk by there on a busy day, you might remember some of the smells. The green dust, the chicken and feathers, the coal dust, and the welding gas. That was quite right. Just south of a great big red wooden building, Johnny Selaski had his body repaired building before he built the new one just east. And our last stop is a bunch of really old buildings all along now, just south of Selaski's building. There was on the east side, there was a big two-story building, brown shingles, and it seemed to be vacant most of the time. But I know for a while there was a cement and plastering business in there. Everheis and Dutch Robinson were involved for a while. In the middle two buildings, old buildings, my grandpa Johnson, Eskel Johnson, was in the corn chilling, house moving, all sorts of stuff. And there was another big building behind where he had most of his big equipment. That's where I hung out. Got to know Garva a bit as a forever. And the last stop, that long, narrow white building, right to the west, A&A Illinois Cargo, over the road, trucking, run by Fred the Man. Now, that's our quick trip around town. What do we see? Well, we found out that it was a busy place. Saturday nights, everybody came downtown, parked the car, shop. All the stores were busy. Sometimes somebody moved, but someone always came back into town, or into the various stores. It was after World War II. plenty of jobs, plenty of industry. Best, Regal, the Creamery, already mentioned, the Dix Line, the Foundry, Lily Tula, Onahome came in, the Little John Mine. People who lived in Galva, often worked in Galva, and mostly shopped. It was just a neat time to grow up. It was similar time, a neat time to grow up. And all the farm, before the big equipment combines, lots of small and medium farms. And people did well. But then my grandpa Johnson retired just about the time the combine came over, and he was time to retire anyway. You might remember his brother. This is another personal tidbit. Bert Johnson. That was my uncle. You might remember him because he had the steam engine. It was in a lot of parades. Back in the early days, they weren't partners, but they both had several steam engines and several thrashing engines. My grandpa went into the corn showing and house moving and that kind of business. Uncle Bert kept the one steam engine with thrashing machine, but he ran the case store. He farmed some east of town. He owned the property that eventually became Sportsman's Lake. So he was a pretty fun guy. Okay, we've been downtown. One last thing. Picture a cool Saturday afternoon, mid-November. Maybe you're out coming out of the show. Maybe you're just down there. Everything's busy. People downtown. It's cool. Football season's over. Middle of the afternoon, and all of a sudden, the booming voice of Chuck Hay over Lawrence Swanson's PA system can be heard all over downtown. He always promoted shopping downtown. He was always enthusiastic. I remember back in the day, some stores gave up the little green stamps and you get redeem discounts. Also the little yellow tickets. This particular day, he's telling people, get your yellow tickets, put your name on and get over. We're going to be drawing for turkeys just before Thanksgiving. Our last stop was in high school. Anybody get the Rich Fox thing today? That was sort of fun. We drove back to that and back to that. It was good to see Rich. Back in the day, whether you're a good student, an average student, or a not so average student, on nights like this, you got to sort of at least think about the whole high school. A lot of teams were pretty good. We were part of the Blackhawk Conference, 8 teams. About the late 50s is when we went to 10 leagues. No consolidation. We're on our own. Obviously, you remember the days of Rich Falk. Those are pretty good teams. He was old. Pretty good. I even started a few games with him as my senior year. So we had some good teams. Good to remember. We always seemed to have the prettiest and the best church. And one thing for sure, we had the best band, Leonard Smith. And it was fun to be in the band, and it was just a great time. So, that's a walk around. That's some of the things. Sometimes, a couple times I ended this thing with remembering when we went to reunions a while earlier. Some of the guys I hung around with in classic, we always were night guys. And an option would be to be money, but there's nothing much there. The happy hour of the morning farmers but so community is an option. Something like go back to Galva. The West End is an option. See Frank Conway, but it's changed hands. It's burned down. Ice is closed in 72. Jug is torn down. Everything's gone. McKay's is gone. 5 Acres is still there. Mary's, and she runs a nice place. But on a Galva Day night, weekend, pretty noisy, probably not the place to go after one of these places. So, I mentioned the Wani Farm, always class reunions out there. However, about 3 or 4 years ago, that was torn down. Now we're sort of out of options. We're right here. We could just walk across the street to Tony's Log Cabin. Anybody remember Tony's Log Cabin right across the street? Neat place. Tony and Martha. Great food, little bar. He's a real character. However, it burned down this way. So now here we are. Except they didn't middle any. This Kiwani do. But it's a good spot. And if you didn't know it, Midland got in trouble. Like I said, my folks are born there. Kiwani, PK, Galva, they couldn't support it. A guy by the name of Roy Carver bought it. Roy Carver Jr. This is another piece of goofy stuff. But he saved this place. If he didn't come in and buy it, probably wouldn't be a cornfield. Any Iowa fans here? Really? You ever heard of Carver Hawkeye Arena? That's the old man. A zillionaire. Millions. We had two sons, Roy Carver Jr. and John. I know John, but Roy Carver owns this place, and he's put some money into it, and thank goodness he did. So, thanks for the invitation.